From the moment you exhale, you are sending your atoms out into the world. That is not a metaphor, but a measurable physical event. And if you want a specific number, a normal breath of an adult contains about 10 to the 22nd power gas molecules, according to estimates synthesized in modern respiratory physiology by the National Institutes of Health, meaning that with every breath you exhale, tens of thousands of trillions of atoms leave your body and enter the surrounding air. And what is remarkable is that those atoms are not something foreign. They were just a part of you only seconds ago. They may have been in your bloodstream, participating in cellular metabolism, or even part of a glucose molecule being broken down to produce energy in the mitochondria, a process that biochemists since the time of Hans Krebs have described since 1937 in the Krebs cycle. And now those carbon atoms have combined with oxygen to form carbon dioxide and are pushed out when you exhale. You do not feel this. You do not realize you are losing matter, but in reality you are constantly exchanging atoms with the environment. And if you think about it a little more, the natural question arises of where those atoms go after they leave you, whether they disappear completely or simply move to another place in a larger system. And this is the point I want you to pay attention to, because this question does not belong to philosophy or belief. It belongs to physics. It concerns very specific laws that we have verified for over 200 years. And if we understand that, you will begin to see your breath no longer as an unconscious action, but as part of a giant material cycle where atoms continuously leave you, blend into the air, and continue their journey in the universe. To understand exactly what is leaving you with every breath, we need to take a step back and look directly at the more basic question: what are you really made of at the atomic level? And the answer is not vague or abstract. An average human body contains about 7 times 10 to the 27th power atoms. That is 7 octillion atoms, a number estimated in modern quantitative biological studies, including analysis published by Harvard University in 2012. And what is interesting is that these atoms are not distributed randomly, but follow a very specific formula. About 65% of your body mass is oxygen, mostly in water, which makes up about 60% of the body. And in organic molecules, about 18% is carbon, the element that forms the backbone for all biological molecules, from proteins to DNA. About 10% is hydrogen, mostly bonded with oxygen to form water, but also appearing in lipids and carbohydrates. And about 3% is nitrogen, an essential element in amino acids and nucleotides, the basic units of life. The rest, about a few percent, includes calcium and phosphorus, especially important in bones and teeth, along with trace elements like iron and hemoglobin, sodium and potassium in nerve signaling. And all these atoms, with those exact proportions, are arranged in an extremely sophisticated structure to create what you call your body. And once you see clearly that your body is only a collection of atoms arranged in a certain order, the next step is to understand something even more important, which is that those atoms cannot simply disappear when you exhale, because the entire story is governed by a fundamental principle of physics. That is the first law of thermodynamics, which simply states that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. They can only change from one form to another. And if you think this is just an abstract idea, then in fact it has a very specific history. At the end of the 18th century, the French chemist Antoine Lavoisier conducted a series of extremely precise experiments with scales. Around 1789, he proved that when you burn a substance in a closed system, the total mass before and after the reaction is the same. Nothing is lost. Nothing appears from nothing. And that discovery laid the foundation for all modern chemistry, which was later summarized in his famous statement that nothing is created, nothing is destroyed, everything is transformed. And this is not only true in Lavoisier's laboratory, it is true in your body, true in every breath you take, because when you exhale, you do not make the carbon or oxygen atoms disappear. You only change the way they are bonded together and where they exist. Let's take a very simple example to see this more clearly. When you burn a piece of coal, what really happens is not that the carbon disappears, but that the carbon atoms in the coal react with oxygen in the air to form carbon dioxide. And if you weigh the entire system, including the gas produced, you will see the mass is completely conserved. No atoms disappear, only the chemical bonds are rearranged. And the same thing is happening inside you every second. In your cells, glucose, a molecule with the formula C6H12O6, is oxidized in the mitochondria through a complex chain of biochemical reactions, producing energy in the form of ATP that your body uses to maintain all vital activities. And the byproducts of that process are carbon dioxide and water, meaning the carbon atoms that were once in the sugar molecule you ate have now been released in the form of carbon dioxide gas. And when that carbon dioxide is transported through the blood to the lungs and you exhale, you are not losing that carbon. You are simply moving it from a biological structure inside your body to the outside environment, where it continues to exist and participate in other processes. And if you track a specific carbon atom, you will see that it may begin its journey in a glucose molecule in an apple, be eaten by you, become part of your cell, then be oxidized in the mitochondria, become carbon dioxide, be exhaled, blend into the air, be absorbed by a tree through photosynthesis, become part of cellulose in the tree trunk, and then return to the biological cycle. All of that happening without any atoms being destroyed or newly created. And this applies to every atom you exhale, not only carbon, but also oxygen and hydrogen in the water vapor you release. All of them continue to exist. They simply are no longer inside you. And this is the point I want you to truly grasp, because when you think about losing the atoms in your breath, you may imagine they vanish into nothingness, but physics does not allow that to happen. Every atom you exhale is still there, still has the same number of protons, neutrons, and electrons as before, still obeys the same laws, only they have left the structure you call your body and become part of the larger environment. And if you look at the world this way, you will begin to see that the boundary between you and the outside world is not a hard boundary, but a continuous flow of matter, where atoms enter and leave your body all the time. And the law of conservation of matter ensures that nothing in that process is lost. Only the arrangement of the atoms changes. To understand exactly the path by which the atoms leave your body, we need to look at the lungs as a system that continuously exchanges matter with the outside environment, rather than just an organ that helps you breathe. Because at the physical level, the lungs are where the boundary between you and the air almost completely disappears. According to physiological data synthesized by the American Thoracic Society, the lungs of an adult contain about 300 million alveoli, tiny structures like extremely small bubbles, each only about 200 micrometers in diameter. But when combined, the entire system creates a gas exchange surface area of about 70 square meters, equivalent to the area of a small tennis court, folded and packed inside the chest. And this large area is not a random detail, but a necessary condition to allow tens of thousands of trillions of gas molecules to be exchanged every day between the blood and the air. Because if the area were too small, the exchange rate would not be enough to sustain life. What makes this system even more special is the thickness of the membrane separating blood and air. The alveolar membrane is only about 0.5 micrometers thick. That is about 100 times thinner than a human hair. And when scaled down to the atomic level, this distance becomes almost meaningless, because gas molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide can move through this membrane almost instantly. And what is remarkable is that this process does not require any active mechanisms like pumps or energy transport. It occurs completely naturally through diffusion, a physical phenomenon in which molecules move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Specifically in this case, the oxygen in the air you inhale has a higher partial pressure than in the venous blood. So oxygen molecules automatically move through the alveolar membrane into the blood, while carbon dioxide, the byproduct of cellular respiration, has a higher concentration in the blood than in the air. So it moves in the opposite direction, from the blood into the air in the alveoli. And the entire process occurs simultaneously across hundreds of millions of alveoli. Each alveolus is a small exchange point, but all operating at the same time creates an extremely efficient material exchange system. If you want to visualize the scale of this phenomenon, remember that every second your body releases billions of carbon dioxide molecules through the lungs, and each carbon dioxide molecule contains one carbon atom that was once part of you, once participated in cell structure, once part of a glucose or lipid molecule, and is now leaving you through a completely passive process, without consciousness, without control. And this happens continuously, without stopping. Even when you are sleeping, thinking, or reading these lines, the lungs are still performing their role as a gateway for material exchange between you and the world, where atoms continuously move in and out. And if you look a little deeper, you will realize that there is no hard boundary separating your body from the surrounding environment at the atomic level, because what you call inside and outside are actually distinguished only at the perceptual and biological level, while at the physical level, atoms move back and forth freely through this extremely thin membrane, and the lungs are only one of the places where that exchange occurs most strongly, because here the concentration difference is continuously maintained, ensuring that molecules always have a tendency to move, and this movement itself is the mechanism that allows atoms to leave you and blend into the surrounding environment, not in large noticeable bursts, but in a continuous, stable, and almost invisible flow. And when you exhale, what really happens is not just pushing air out, but releasing a part of your own matter into the larger system, where those atoms will continue their journey, detached from the original biological structure and participating in other physical and chemical processes. From the extremely sophisticated structure of the lungs and the diffusion mechanism occurring on the alveolar surface, the next thing to realize is how large the scale of this entire process is, because when you look at each individual breath, it seems very small, almost insignificant, but when you put it in the context of time and quantity, you will see a completely different picture. An average adult breathes about 12 to 20 times per minute. This number recorded in standard physiology documents in the United States and taught in medical programs of the American Lung Association. And if you take the average number of about 16 breaths per minute, that means you perform about 960 breaths per hour, about 23,000 breaths per day. And if you multiply this number by the number of molecules in each breath we mentioned earlier, about 10 to the 22nd power molecules, you will get a number of about 10 to the 26th power gas molecules exchanged every day between your body and the surrounding environment. That is 100 million trillion molecules. And what is remarkable is that this is not the total number of molecules existing in your body, but the number of molecules continuously entering and leaving, meaning every day you are replacing a significant portion of your matter through the breathing process. And if you try to imagine the number 10 to the 26th power, you will quickly realize that it far exceeds all human direct experience. For easier comparison, astronomers estimate that the Milky Way contains about 10 to the 11th to 4 times 10 to the 11th stars, meaning the number of molecules you exchange in just one day is millions of trillions of times greater than the number of stars in our entire galaxy. And this is not a literary comparison, but a way to place the scale of the breathing process in a context you can begin to feel, because when you say you are just breathing, in reality you are participating in a giant material flow with a scale far beyond any system you can observe directly. And what is even more important is that this flow is completely invisible. You do not see the molecules entering and leaving. You do not hear them. You do not feel the movement of trillions of atoms through the alveolar membrane every second. But that does not make this process any less real. On the contrary, it makes it more remarkable, because one of the features of physics at the micro level is that the most important processes often occur outside our direct perception. And if you expand your view a little more, you will see that this process is not just simple gas exchange, but part of a much larger system in which atoms continuously move between living bodies and the environment, from you to the air, from the air to plants, from plants to other animals, and back into the ecosystem. And with every breath you exhale, you are contributing a small part to that flow, not in a special or personal way, but in a completely universal way, just like every other living creature breathing on this planet. And this leads to an important realization that you are not a closed system. You do not keep your atoms unchanged over time, but you continuously exchange them with the surrounding world. And that process occurs on a huge scale, at high speed, and with a level of continuity that without specific numbers to illustrate, you would very easily underestimate. And it is these numbers, 20,000 breaths per day, 10 to the 22nd power molecules per breath, 10 to the 26th power molecules exchanged per day, that show that breathing is not only a biological function, but a large physical process, where matter continuously moves through the boundary between your body and the surrounding universe. To understand more deeply what you are really exhaling when you breathe, we need to go into the origin of carbon dioxide right inside your body. Because carbon dioxide does not appear randomly, but is produced through a very specific chain of biochemical reactions occurring in the mitochondria of the cell. Those tiny structures, often called the powerhouses of the cell, where cellular respiration takes place, that biochemists have studied for over a century, especially the work of Hans Krebs in 1937, when he described the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. And if you look at this process from a chemical perspective, you will see that it starts from glucose, a molecule with the formula C6H12O6, which you absorb from food like bread, fruit, or any carbohydrate source, and in the presence of oxygen you inhale. This glucose molecule is oxidized through a series of complex enzyme reactions. The final result can be summarized by the general equation: C6H12O6 plus 6O2 produces 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy. And the energy here is not an abstract concept, but is stored in the form of ATP molecules, adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency of the cell. Each glucose molecule can produce about 30 to 32 ATP molecules, depending on physiological conditions. And the important thing to realize is that in this process, the carbon atoms originally in glucose do not disappear, but are rearranged to form carbon dioxide, meaning every carbon dioxide molecule you exhale carries a carbon atom that was once part of the food you consumed. And if you trace further back, that carbon may have once been in a wheat plant, an apple or a corn plant, created through photosynthesis by absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And now it has gone through your digestive system, become part of your cell, participated in metabolic reactions, and finally returned to the air in the form of carbon dioxide. And this does not happen at a few isolated locations, but occurs simultaneously in tens of trillions of cells in your body. Physiologists estimate that the human body has about 30 to 40 trillion cells, and in each cell, thousands of biochemical reactions occur every second, meaning the total number of cellular respiration reactions occurring in your body every second is a huge number, up to thousands of trillions. And each of those reactions contributes to producing carbon dioxide. So when you exhale, you are releasing the product of a chemical process occurring continuously and on an extremely large scale throughout your entire body. And if you look at a specific carbon atom in a carbon dioxide molecule you just exhaled, you can imagine that just a few minutes earlier, it may have been part of a glucose molecule in the blood. A few hours earlier, it was in a meal you just consumed. A few days earlier, it may have been in a crop that absorbed carbon dioxide from the air. And if you continue tracing back, you will see that that atom has gone through a long journey through many ecosystems before becoming part of you. And this shows that every carbon atom you exhale is not just a meaningless byproduct, but carries a long biological history, shaped by physical and chemical processes, extending from the cellular level to the entire ecosystem. And what makes this story even more interesting is that all of this happens without any conscious intervention from you. You do not need to think about the Krebs cycle or the chemical equation for this process to occur. It is controlled by enzymes, chemical gradients, and physical laws, operating continuously to maintain your life. And with every breath you exhale, you are completing one loop of this cycle, releasing carbon dioxide molecules carrying carbon atoms that have completed their role in your body and are ready to participate in other processes in the environment. And when you put all of this together, you will see that your breath is not just simple gas exchange, but the manifestation of a complex network of chemical reactions connecting your body to the surrounding biological and physical world. The carbon dioxide molecules you just created in the mitochondria do not stay in place, but immediately begin to move out of the cell, because at the micro level, nothing stands still. Everything is always affected by concentration and energy differences, and it is that difference that causes carbon dioxide molecules to diffuse through the cell membrane into the surrounding interstitial fluid, then quickly enter the nearest blood capillaries, where the circulatory system begins to take on the transport role. And the important thing to understand is that carbon dioxide does not simply float in the blood in gas form, but mostly about 70%, according to modern physiological studies, is converted into bicarbonate ions, HCO3-, through a very fast chemical reaction occurring in red blood cells. This reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, one of the fastest acting enzymes in the body, with the equation carbon dioxide plus H2O reversibly forming H2CO3, then reversibly forming H plus HCO3-. And thanks to this mechanism, blood can transport a large amount of carbon in dissolved form without changing the pH too much, while about 20 to 25% of the remaining carbon dioxide binds with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin, and a small portion exists as directly dissolved gas in the plasma, and the entire transport process occurs at an astonishing speed, because blood circulates through the body in about 60 seconds, and in many cases, a carbon dioxide molecule created in a muscle cell can reach the lungs in just a few seconds, and when the blood-carrying bicarbonate reaches the capillaries surrounding the alveoli, the chemical process begins to reverse. Bicarbonate is converted back into carbon dioxide in the red blood cells, also under the action of carbonic anhydrase, increasing the carbon dioxide concentration in the blood in that area. And it is that increase that creates a concentration gradient between the blood and the air in the alveoli, where the carbon dioxide concentration is lower, causing carbon dioxide molecules to diffuse through the alveolar membrane, the extremely thin membrane described earlier, only about 0.5 micrometers thick, and because the distance is so small, this movement occurs almost instantly. The carbon dioxide molecules pass through the membrane into the alveolar space, where they mix with the air you are about to exhale, and when you exhale, billions of carbon dioxide molecules leave your body at the same time, carrying carbon atoms that were once part of your biological structure. And what is remarkable is that the entire journey, from when carbon dioxide is created in the mitochondria until it escapes the body, takes only a few seconds, a time so short that you cannot feel it, but enough to complete a full material cycle. And if you try to track a specific carbon atom, you will see that it goes through a continuous journey, from being part of a glucose molecule, participating in the Krebs cycle, becoming carbon dioxide, being transported in the blood in the form of bicarbonate, returning to carbon dioxide form in the lungs, diffusing through the alveolar membrane, and finally being pushed out when you exhale. And it is that very moment, when the carbon dioxide molecule leaves the alveolus and enters the exhaled airstream, that the carbon atom is no longer part of you. It has left the biological structure you call your body. And the important thing is that this departure is not temporary, unlike the oxygen you inhale and use then replace, but is a one-way process, because as soon as these molecules leave the body, they are immediately mixed with thousands of trillions of other molecules in the air, and there is no mechanism for them to return to your body in the original way. You may inhale other molecules, but you will never get back exactly the atoms you just exhaled, because the air system around you is an open environment where molecules continuously collide, mix and disperse, and this makes every carbon atom leaving you become part of a larger system, separated from you in the physical sense, although still existing. And if you think about this seriously, you will realize that every breath is not just gas exchange, but an irreversible transfer of matter, where atoms continuously leave you and never return in the same form. And this process occurs continuously, every second, every minute, forming an uninterrupted flow of matter from your body to the outside world. From the moment those carbon dioxide molecules leave your body and blend into the air, a basic physical mechanism begins to govern their journey, and that mechanism is called diffusion, a process in which molecules automatically spread from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration without any external controlling force. And the important thing to understand is that diffusion is not a clearly directed motion, but the result of countless random movements of molecules at the microscopic level, a phenomenon that scientists have observed since the 19th century and was quantitatively explained by Albert Einstein in his famous 1905 work on Brownian motion, in which he proved that small particles in a liquid or gas are constantly moving due to collisions with surrounding molecules. And it is these collisions that create a form of chaotic motion, which when observed on a larger scale manifests as the even spreading of matter. And if you imagine a carbon dioxide molecule that has just left your lungs, it does not fly straight along any path, but is continuously collided with from all sides by nitrogen and oxygen molecules in the air, each collision changing its direction and velocity. And this happens with extremely high frequency. Gas molecules at room temperature have an average velocity of several hundred meters per second, and they collide with each other billions of times per second, meaning that in a very short time, a carbon dioxide molecule can change direction countless times, creating a complex zigzag trajectory. And although the motion of each individual molecule is completely random, when you consider thousands of trillions of molecules at once, you will see a clear trend that they gradually disperse into the surrounding space. And it is this process that causes the air you just exhaled not to stay in one place, but to quickly mix with the surrounding air. And this does not depend on whether you are in a closed room or outdoors, because even in a still room, gas molecules are still constantly moving and mixing with each other. And if you want a more specific image, imagine you drop a drop of ink into a glass of water. You will see the ink gradually spread until the color becomes uniform throughout the glass, not because someone stirs it, but because the molecules move and disperse on their own. And the same thing is happening with the carbon dioxide molecules you just exhaled, only in the air. The process happens faster and on a much larger scale. And what is remarkable is that diffusion not only spreads the molecules, but also erases all traces of their original origin. Because after a very short time, there is no way to distinguish which carbon dioxide molecules came from your breath and which were already in the air. All become part of a uniform gas mixture. And this means that right after you exhale, your atoms no longer belong to you in any physical sense. They become part of the common environment, drawn into the chaotic motion of thousands of trillions of other molecules. And from that point, their journey is no longer limited to the scope of your body, but begins to expand into the surrounding space, spreading farther and farther, not in a straight line, but through a random dispersion process that is irreversible. The mixing of molecules in the air happens so quickly that it almost immediately erases all traces of their original origin. And this means that within just a few seconds after you exhale, the carbon dioxide molecules that were once part of your body have blended into the surrounding environment in a way that no practical method can distinguish them from thousands of trillions of other molecules. Because at the microscopic level, air is not a static environment, but an extremely dynamic system where nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor molecules are constantly moving and colliding with each other. At enormous frequency, each molecule can collide billions of times in a second, and each such collision completely changes its direction and velocity, causing the original trajectory to quickly lose its trace. And after a sufficient number of collisions, the information about the molecule's initial position and state is almost erased from the system, not because it disappears, but because it has been dispersed into countless different possible states. And this is the very nature of the mixing process, where molecules not only spread out, but also lose all identifying features related to their origin. And if you try to imagine tracking a specific carbon atom from your breath, you will see that right after it leaves your lungs, it begins colliding with surrounding molecules, each collision sending it in a new direction. And after an extremely short time, there is no way to determine its original path, nor can you say it once belonged to your body, because it has become an inseparable part of the common gas mixture. And this phenomenon is not random, but reflects a deeper principle in physics, which is the natural tendency of systems to move toward a state of higher entropy, described by the second law of thermodynamics, in which entropy can be understood as the number of microstates a system can exist in. And when your carbon dioxide molecules leave your body, they move from a highly organized state, where atoms are precisely arranged in biological molecules, to a dispersed state in the air, where they can exist in countless different configurations, and this increases the entropy of the system, because the number of possible arrangements of molecules in the air is vastly greater than when they were bound in your body. And once entropy has increased, the system has no tendency to automatically return to the initial state, because that would require a decrease in entropy, a process that is extremely unlikely to occur under natural conditions. And this is why the mixing of molecules is irreversible, not because of an absolute prohibition, but because the probability of all molecules rearranging themselves exactly into their original positions is nearly zero. And if you think about this in practical terms, you will realize that when you exhale, you have lost control over those atoms. They are no longer part of the system you can call your body. They have become part of a larger environment where they continue to move, collide, and mix with other molecules. And there is no mechanism in nature that can separate them and return them to your body in the old way. And this means that the loss of atoms you experience with every breath is not the disappearance of matter, but the loss of the individual identity of those atoms. They still exist, still carry the same number of protons, neutrons, and electrons as before, but they are no longer connected to you, no longer part of the biological structure you call yourself. And it is this separation that makes the breathing process more profound when viewed from a physical perspective, because every breath is not just gas exchange, but a step in the irreversible dispersion of matter, where atoms leave you, dissolve into the world, and lose all traces of their original origin. And when you take this seriously, you will see that the boundary between you and the surrounding environment is not a fixed line, but a continuous transition zone, where atoms constantly move in and out, but once they have left and become mixed, they do not return as before. And that is why, in practical terms, you have truly lost those atoms, not because they no longer exist, but because they no longer belong to you in any recognizable way. The mixing process at small scale quickly leads to a much larger phenomenon, as the molecules do not stop within the room, but continue to be transported far away by atmospheric motion, because the air on Earth never stands still, but is constantly stirred by wind, temperature differences, and large-scale convection currents. And these factors act as a giant transport system, carrying your atoms everywhere. When air near the Earth's surface heats up, it expands and becomes lighter, causing it to rise, while cooler air above moves downward, creating continuous convection currents. And in that process, gas molecules are carried along, moving vertically and then spreading horizontally under the influence of wind. And on a larger scale, weather systems like low and high pressure continuously shift, pulling huge masses of air, hundreds to thousands of kilometers. And this is not a slow process, but occurs at a significant speed. Meteorological data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration show that winds in the lower troposphere can reach speeds of 10 to 50 kilometers under normal conditions, and in stronger systems like storms or strong jet streams, speeds can far exceed that. This means the carbon dioxide molecules you exhale can be carried hundreds of kilometers in just a few days, and if they are carried into higher atmospheric layers, they can access one of the planet's strongest transport systems, the jet stream, a narrow but extremely fast air current flowing at altitudes of about 9 to 16 kilometers, with speeds that can reach 100 to 250 kilometers, even higher in some cases. And meteorologists from the National Weather Service have recorded that gas particles can be transported across continents via these jet streams in just a few days. For example, dust from the Sahara Desert can travel to the Americas, or volcanic ash from Iceland can spread across Europe in a short time. And although carbon dioxide molecules are much smaller than dust or ash, they follow the same laws of atmospheric motion, being carried by air currents and spreading on a large scale. And if you imagine a carbon atom leaving your lungs in a city in the United States, it can be carried by wind across neighboring states within 1 or 2 days, then continue moving with weather systems, possibly crossing the Atlantic within a week if conditions are right. And all of this happens without any distinction between molecules, with no identifying mark showing that the atom once belonged to you, because once blended into the atmosphere, it becomes part of a chaotic and constantly changing system where air currents mix and redistribute matter on a global scale. And the important thing to realize is that this process does not happen with just a few individual molecules, but with the entire amount of carbon dioxide you exhale each day. Hundreds of thousands of trillions of molecules are continuously released and immediately join the moving currents of the atmosphere, and their spreading speed is no longer limited by your body, but depends on the dynamics of the entire Earth's atmospheric system. And this makes the journey of the atoms much faster and wider than you can imagine, because in a very short time, the atoms that were once in your body are no longer in their original position, no longer in the room, no longer in the city, but have begun to spread into a much larger area, drawn into air currents, and continuing to move according to the physical laws governing the atmosphere. And if you view the entire process as a continuous system, you will see that there is no clear stopping point, no moment when the atoms stop, only continuous motion. The scale of spreading does not stop at the regional or continental level, but continues to expand until the gas molecules blend into the global circulation system of the atmosphere, a system that has been studied extensively in meteorological science and described in detail in NASA's circulation models, where scientists use satellite data and computer simulations to track how air masses move around Earth over time. And from these studies, it is known that the atmosphere is not a collection of static layers, but a dynamic system in which molecules are continuously mixed and redistributed on a global scale, with the complete mixing time of air in the troposphere ranging from a few months to a few years, depending on climate conditions and geographic location. This means the carbon dioxide molecules you exhale today will not only move regionally, but over time will be dispersed to every place on the planet, from North America to Europe, from Asia to Africa, and even to the polar regions, where the air seems isolated, but in reality still participates in the global circulation cycle. And if you look at the atmospheric maps published by NASA, you will see huge flows of air moving around Earth, carrying water vapor, carbon dioxide, and other gases, forming a continuous material exchange network, covering the entire planet. And in that network, there is no concept of national borders or geographic boundaries in the way humans define them, because air does not stop at any line on the map. It continuously moves, mixes, and redistributes. And this means the carbon atoms you exhale are not limited to the country or continent where you live, but will gradually spread everywhere, becoming part of the global atmosphere. And if you wait long enough, the probability that a carbon atom from your breath is present at any point on Earth becomes significant, because the global circulation system ensures that air is continuously mixed over time. And studies on the distribution of tracer gases in the atmosphere have shown that substances emitted in one area can be detected in very distant areas after a relatively short time. For example, nuclear tests in the 20th century left radioactive traces detectable worldwide, showing the strong mixing of the atmosphere. And although carbon dioxide is not as easily tracked as radioactive isotopes, it still follows the same transport and dispersion laws. And therefore your atoms, after leaving your body and blending into the air, will gradually become part of this system, spreading across the planet, not in a straight line or specific direction, but through countless flows, collisions, and redistributions. And the important thing to realize is that this process is not an exception, but the normal state of the atmosphere, a state in which every molecule has the potential to move and be dispersed on a global scale over time. And when you place yourself in this picture, you will see that every breath you take not only affects your immediate environment, but contributes to a much larger material cycle where atoms are continuously exchanged, dispersed and reused across the entire planet. And in that context, the idea of an original position becomes meaningless, because after a sufficiently long time, your atoms are no longer tied to the place where you exhaled them, but have become part of the global atmosphere, present in many places at once, in a continuously moving and changing system. The global flow of the atmosphere is not the end of the journey, but only a transitional step that brings your atoms into another deeper cycle in biology, where plants act as a gateway, bringing carbon from the air back into the living world. And the central process here is photosynthesis, one of the most important chemical reactions on Earth, which can be represented by the familiar equation: 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 H2O produces C6H12O6 plus 6 O2 under the influence of sunlight, meaning 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules, when supplied with energy from light, are rearranged to form 1 glucose molecule, along with 6 oxygen molecules, released back into the atmosphere. And the important thing in this equation is not only the final product, but how the atoms are reorganized, because the carbon atoms in the carbon dioxide you exhale are not lost, but are captured by plants through tiny pores called stomata on the leaf surface, where carbon dioxide from the air diffuses into the leaf according to the concentration gradient, then is taken into the chloroplasts, where photosynthesis reactions occur, especially the Calvin cycle, where carbon is fixed into organic compounds. And this process was studied in detail by biochemists like Melvin Calvin in the 1940s, earning him the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1961. And if you track a specific carbon atom from your breath, you can imagine it moving in the atmosphere, being absorbed by a leaf, participating in the Calvin cycle, and becoming part of a glucose molecule. And from there, glucose can be used in many different ways in the plant. It can be converted into cellulose to build plant cells, become part of the plant stem, leaves or roots, or be used as an energy source for the plant itself through cellular respiration of plants. And this means the carbon atom that once belonged to you now no longer exists in the form of gas in the air, but has become part of the physical structure of another living organism. And if you expand your view, you will see that this process occurs on a global scale. Billions of green trees, algae, and other plants continuously absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every day, with the total amount of carbon fixed through photosynthesis estimated at about 100 to 120 gigatons of carbon per year, according to modern ecological studies. And in that giant flow, the carbon atoms you exhale are not an exception, but a small but real part participating in this cycle. And what is interesting is that this process does not happen immediately, but depends on many factors, such as geographic location, weather conditions, sunlight, and the biological activity of the ecosystem. But over time, the probability that a carbon dioxide atom from your breath is absorbed by a plant becomes increasingly high, because the atmosphere is continuously mixed, and plants always take carbon dioxide from the surrounding environment to sustain life. And when that happens, your carbon atom is no longer part of the air, but becomes part of the biological world, part of a leaf that is photosynthesizing, a growing plant stem, or an operating ecosystem. And if you look at a forest, you may think it is a system separate from you, but at the atomic level, there is a continuous exchange between you and the trees. You exhale carbon dioxide. Trees absorb carbon dioxide. You inhale the oxygen that trees produce. And this cycle connects you to plants in a very direct but often overlooked way. And this leads to an important realization that the boundary between your body and the surrounding biological environment is not a fixed boundary, but part of a continuous cycle in which atoms move back and forth between different forms of existence, from the atmosphere into organisms, from one organism to another, and back to the atmosphere. And when a carbon atom from your breath becomes part of glucose in a leaf, it does not simply change position, but changes role, from a gas molecule participating in the chemical balance of the atmosphere to a structural component of a living organism, participating in biological processes such as growth, metabolism, and interaction with the environment. And this shows that the atoms you release do not just disappear into the air, but actually participate in a complex network of physical and biological processes where they are reused, restructured, and integrated into other living systems. Once your carbon atom has become part of a plant, the story does not stop there, but continues into a much more complex network, which is the food chain, where matter is transferred from one organism to another through consumption and metabolism. And the entire process lies within a larger system called the carbon cycle, a biogeochemical cycle describing how carbon moves between the atmosphere, living organisms, soil and oceans for millions of years. And in this cycle, plants serve as the entry point for carbon from the air into biology. But they do not keep that carbon forever, because when an animal eats a plant, the organic molecules such as glucose, cellulose, and starch containing carbon are taken into that animal's body, where they continue to be broken down and restructured to serve new biological functions. And if you imagine a cow eating grass, the carbon in the carbon dioxide that the grass absorbed now becomes part of the cow's body, possibly in muscles, fat, or other biological molecules. And then, when humans consume meat or products from that cow, the carbon atoms continue to be transferred to the human body. And this process is not rare, but a fundamental feature of the ecosystem, where every organism depends on others to sustain life. And in each step of the food chain, atoms are not lost, but only redistributed, moving from one biological structure to another. And this means the carbon atom you exhaled can become part of a plant, then become part of an animal, then return to a human or another organism. And this cycle continues to repeat with no clear ending point. And if you expand your view, you will see that the food chain is not just a simple straight line, but a complex network where a carbon atom can travel through many different paths, possibly becoming part of a rice plant, then entering the human body through food, or entering the body of an insect, then being eaten by a bird, and continuing to be transferred. And in each of those steps, the carbon atom retains its physical nature, but constantly changes its role and position in the ecosystem. And this shows that there is no final state for an atom, no place where it stops forever, because biological systems are always active, always consuming and reusing matter. And even when an organism dies, microorganisms will decompose its body, releasing carbon back into the soil or atmosphere, where it can be absorbed by plants again. And the cycle begins anew. And modern ecological studies show that this carbon cycle occurs on a global scale at an astonishing rate, with hundreds of gigatons of carbon exchanged each year between different systems. And in that flow, individual carbon atoms have no separate identity, but are only small components that are continuously reused. And if you return to your own breath, you will see that the carbon atoms you just exhaled will not stay in the air forever, but over time will enter biology, become part of plants, then continue moving through the food chain, and perhaps one day return to the body of another organism. And this changes the way you look at your own body, because it shows that you are not a separate system, but part of a continuous material exchange network, where atoms do not belong to any organism permanently, but only pass through biological structures for a certain period of time. From the flow of the food chain does not stop at atoms moving from plants to animals, but continues to return to humans, because everything you eat every day is the result of a long history of carbon that has moved through many different forms of life. When you eat an apple, a bowl of rice, or a piece of meat, you are bringing into your body organic molecules containing carbon. And these carbon atoms are not new, but have existed before in ecosystems. They may have once been in the air as carbon dioxide, then absorbed by a plant through photosynthesis, becoming glucose, then converted into cellulose or starch, then eaten by an animal, and finally reaching you through the food chain. And when they enter your body, these molecules do not keep their original structure, but are broken down in the digestive system, absorbed into the blood, and restructured to become part of your body, possibly becoming muscle, enzymes, hormones, or any biological structure necessary for life. And this means your body is continuously rebuilt from external matter, not a fixed system, but a dynamic structure that always changes over time. And if you look at this from a physical perspective, you will see that no atom belongs to you in a permanent sense. They only temporarily participate in your structure before leaving and continuing their journey. And this leads to a very clear consequence, which is that the atoms you exhale today can completely become part of another person's body in the future, because after leaving you, they blend into the atmosphere, are absorbed by plants, pass through the food chain, and eventually enter the body of another creature, possibly an animal or a human. And this process is not rare, but occurs continuously on a global scale, with billions of people and countless organisms participating in this material exchange cycle. And if you consider a long enough period, the probability that a carbon atom that once belonged to you will become part of another person's body is very high, almost certain, because Earth's ecosystem is a materially closed system on a large scale, where atoms are continuously reused. And scientific studies have shown that in every breath you inhale, you may be inhaling a few atoms that once belonged to people who lived in the past. This reflects the profound mixing of the atmosphere and the connection between all living beings. And if you expand this idea, you will see that your body is not a separate entity, but part of a continuous material exchange network, where atoms move from one organism to another, from the environment into biology, and back to the environment. And in that network, the boundary between you and others is no longer clear at the atomic level, because atoms do not carry identity. They do not know who they once belonged to. They only obey physical and chemical laws. And when conditions are right, they participate in new structures. And this means a very small part of you, at the atomic level, can become part of someone else, not in a philosophical or metaphorical sense, but in a completely accurate physical sense. And this process occurs every second, every minute, as everyone on this planet eats, breathes, and exchanges matter with the environment, forming a continuous flow, connecting all living beings. And when you look at this, you will realize that your body is not a fixed block of matter, but a temporary point in that flow, where atoms gather for a period of time, forming the structure you call you, and then continue to leave and participate in other structures. And in this process, atoms do not stop, do not rest, have no ending point. They continuously move, are reused, and restructured in an uninterrupted cycle. The idea that atoms continuously move between bodies does not stop at people living at the same time as you, but also extends back into the past, to humans who existed thousands of years ago. And this is where the story becomes both strange and scientifically accurate, because when you take a breath, there is a very real possibility that in that airstream there are a few atoms that once belonged to Julius Caesar, who lived more than 2,000 years ago. And this is not a symbolic statement, but a conclusion that can be drawn from how the atmosphere mixes over time. Let's start with a few numbers. Each breath you take contains about 10 to the 22nd power gas molecules, while the total number of molecules in Earth's atmosphere is about 10 to the 44th power, meaning each breath you inhale is a very small sample, but still large enough to contain a significant number of molecules that have gone through many different processes in history. And if you assume that Julius Caesar exhaled a similar amount of air as a modern human throughout his life, then the total number of molecules he exhaled is an extremely large number. And over time, those molecules have been completely mixed in the atmosphere through the diffusion mechanisms, wind, and global circulation we have mentioned. And after more than 2 millennia, those molecules are no longer concentrated in any specific area, but have been dispersed almost evenly throughout Earth's entire atmosphere. And when you inhale, you take a small sample from that mixture, and the probability that that sample contains none of the molecules that once belonged to Julius Caesar is actually very low. Physicists have made preliminary estimates and pointed out that in each breath, you may inhale millions to billions of molecules that were once exhaled by a specific person in the past, if that person ever lived and breathed on Earth. And this is not only true for Julius Caesar, but for anyone who has ever existed, from people who lived in the Middle Ages to those in the previous century, because the atmosphere does not retain memory of the molecules' origins. It only mixes them continuously over time. And the result is that everyone on this planet is sharing the same pool of atoms, where molecules are reused time after time. And if you look at this from a statistical perspective, you will see that the chance for a specific atom from the past to exist in today's atmosphere is very high, because atoms are not destroyed in ordinary biological processes, and therefore they continue to exist and participate in different cycles. And when you breathe, you are not only exchanging gas with the current environment, but also with the entire history of the planet, because the air you inhale is the result of billions of years of evolution, mixing and redistribution. And in that mixture, there are atoms that were once part of countless creatures and humans in the past. And this leads to a very interesting realization that history does not only exist in books or relics, but also exists at the material level, in the very air you inhale, where atoms have passed through many bodies, many ecosystems, and many different eras before reaching you. And when you exhale, you continue that cycle, putting your atoms into the common system, where they will be mixed, dispersed, and possibly become part of other people in the future. And when looking at it this way, you will see that every breath is not just an individual biological action, but an intersection point between past, present, and future, where atoms carry their history but do not retain identity, continuously moving and connecting all humans through time. What has just been described about your atoms continuously leaving your body and entering others leads to a deeper realization that you yourself cannot be defined by those very atoms, because if the atoms continuously change while you remain you, then clearly there is something else more stable that exists, and that thing is the pattern, that is the structure, the way matter is arranged and organized, not the individual matter itself, because carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, or nitrogen atoms are physically identical regardless of who they once belonged to. They do not carry any sign saying, I belong to this body, or I belong to that person. They are only basic units obeying natural laws. And what makes the difference between you and an inanimate object lies not in the type of atoms, but in how they are organized into a complex system capable of sustaining life. And to visualize this more clearly, go back to the example of a book. A book is made of paper and ink, and both paper and ink are only collections of atoms. But the content of the book does not lie in each individual atom, but in the way the characters are arranged into words, words into sentences, and sentences into a meaningful story. If you take all the atoms of that book and mix them randomly, you still have the same number of atoms, the same chemical composition, but you no longer have a book because the pattern has been broken, and this is completely similar to your body. The atoms in your body do not carry memory. They do not know who you are. They do not store your thoughts, emotions, or experiences. All of that lies in the way nerve cells are connected in the brain, in the electrical and chemical signals transmitted through that network. That is in the structure and dynamics of the system, not in each individual atoms. And this explains why you still retain your identity, even though atoms are continuously replaced over time. Biological studies show that most of the atoms in your body are replaced within a few years. For example, skin cells are renewed in a few weeks, intestinal cells in a few days, and even bone cells are restructured over time. But you do not feel like you have become a completely different person every time that happens, because the overall pattern of the body, and especially of the brain, is continuously maintained. And this also clarifies an important point in the story about breathing, that when you exhale and the atoms leave your body, you do not lose yourself, because those atoms are not where your identity is stored. They are only temporary material used to maintain that structure. And when they leave, the structure is still maintained by using other atoms from the environment. And if you continue to follow the journey of those atoms, you will see that when they enter another body, they do not carry any part of you in a personal sense. They do not carry memories, do not carry consciousness, do not carry any characteristics related to you. They only become part of a new pattern, a completely different new structure, like taking ink atoms from one book and using them to print another book. Those atoms do not carry the content of the old book. The content lies in the way they are arranged. And this leads to a very important conclusion, that your identity is not something attached to specific matter, but a form of organization of matter, a dynamic pattern maintained through continuous biological processes. And when looking at it this way, you will see that life is not about keeping the same atoms, but about maintaining a stable structure in the continuous flow of matter, where atoms come and go, but the pattern persists. And it is that pattern, not the individual atoms, that is what you truly call yourself. And this also changes the way you look at the relationship between you and the surrounding world. Because if you are not the atoms, but the way they are organized, then the boundary between you and the environment is no longer a fixed material boundary, but a continuous process in which matter is exchanged but the structure is maintained. And in that process, atoms are only temporary components, always moving, always being replaced. Your existence as a stable structure, while atoms continuously change, can only be fully understood when placed in the context of a fundamental law governing the entire universe, which is the second law of thermodynamics. And this law states that in a closed system, entropy, or the degree of disorder, tends to increase over time, not because some force compels everything to become chaotic, but because the number of disordered microstates is always vastly greater than the number of ordered states. And therefore, in terms of probability, the system almost certainly moves toward the most likely state. And if you imagine a room full of air, in which one corner has a higher carbon dioxide concentration because you just exhaled, then over time, the molecules will spread and mix evenly throughout the entire space, not because someone stirs them, but because the random motion of the molecules makes the uniformly distributed state much more probable than the initial concentrated state. And once this uniform state is achieved, there is almost no natural possibility that makes the molecules return to concentrate in one corner as before, because that would require a decrease in entropy, a decrease in the number of possible states of the system, and this is extremely unlikely to occur. And when applying this principle to your body, you will see that the atoms in the body exist in a highly ordered state. They are precisely arranged in biological molecules, in cells, in tissues, and in organ systems. And this state has a very limited number of microconfigurations compared to the state those atoms can exist in when dispersed in the environment. And therefore, when you exhale, the carbon atoms in carbon dioxide leave the ordered structure of the body and enter the air, where they can exist in countless different positions and configurations. And this increases the entropy of the overall system, because the number of states the atoms can occupy in the air is vastly greater than when they were bound in your body. And the important thing to understand is that this process is not an exception, but a direct manifestation of the universe's natural tendency, where every system tends toward the statistically most probable state, and that state is usually the more dispersed, chaotic state. And this is precisely why the dispersion of the atoms in your breath is irreversible, because for those atoms to automatically return to your body and rearrange into their exact original positions, the system would have to go from a high entropy state to a lower entropy state, something that goes against the general trend and has a probability close to zero. And this applies not only to breathing, but to every physical process in the universe, from a hot cup of coffee gradually cooling to an object falling and not flying back up on its own, all reflecting the same principle that systems move toward equilibrium and greater disorder over time. And what is interesting is that although the general trend is increasing entropy, ordered structures like your body can still exist, but only if they are not closed systems. Your body continuously receives energy from food and the environment and uses that energy to maintain its structure, while at the same time releasing heat and products like carbon dioxide, contributing to increasing the entropy of the surrounding environment. And this means you maintain local order by exporting chaos outward. And every time you exhale, you are doing exactly that. You are releasing carbon dioxide molecules, carrying energy and matter into the environment, where they disperse and increase the entropy of the atmosphere. And when you view the entire process as a unified system, you will see that your breath is not just a biological action, but part of a larger flow, where local order is maintained while global disorder increases. And your atoms, when leaving your body, are not simply moving, but are participating in the most basic tendency of the universe, a tendency toward dispersion, mixing and increasing entropy. And this tendency is not something that can be avoided or reversed, but a fundamental law governing all physical processes, from the atomic level to the scale of the universe. The key point of everything that has just been presented is that your body is not a fixed block of matter, but a system that is always changing, and that change occurs continuously at the atomic level without you even realizing it. Studies in biology and medicine show that most of the atoms in the human body are replaced over time, and although the exact number depends on each type of tissue and each element, a common estimate is that within about 7 to 10 years, most of the matter in your body has been renewed. This does not mean that all atoms are replaced at the same time, but is a process that happens gradually, continuously, every day, every hour, every second, when you eat, when you breathe, when the cells in your body divide, die, and are replaced. And if you look at specific tissues, you will see that this rate of change is even more impressive. Epidermal skin cells are renewed in about 2 to 4 weeks. Intestinal cells exist for only a few days before being replaced. Red blood cells live about 120 days before being broken down and renewed. And even bones, which seem the hardest and most stable, are continuously restructured through a process called remodeling, in which old bone cells are broken down and replaced by new bone tissue in a cycle lasting several years. And all these processes involve exchanging atoms with the environment. You bring atoms into your body through food, water, and air, and you remove atoms through breath, sweat, urine, and other biological processes. And if you return to breathing, you will see that every time you exhale, you are losing a very small part of your matter. But because this process happens continuously and is compensated by you inhaling and eating and drinking, you do not feel that change. Your body maintains relatively stable mass and shape, even though the internal components are continuously replaced. And this leads to an important realization, that you are not a collection of fixed atoms, but a process, a continuous flow of matter and energy, where atoms enter, participate in your structure for a period of time, then leave and are replaced by other atoms. And this does not only happen over a long period, like many years, but occurs every day. Each day you inhale hundreds of liters of air, eat and drink substances containing thousands of trillions of atoms, and at the same time release a similar amount, creating a dynamic balance between receiving and discarding matter. And if you look at your body at 2 points in time, separated by many years, you may see the same shape, the same face, the same identity, but at the atomic level, most of the matter has changed. The atoms that once made up you in the past have left and been replaced by new atoms. And this reinforces the idea mentioned earlier, that your identity does not lie in the atoms, but in the pattern, the structure maintained in that flow. And precisely because of that, when you think about yourself, you should not imagine a fixed block of matter, but a dynamic system, like a river, where water continuously flows through, but the shape of the river is still maintained. And in your case, the atoms are the water flowing through, while the biological structure is the river, and your life is the process of maintaining that flow, while the material components continuously change. And when looking at it this way, the atoms leaving you every time you exhale is not an unusual loss, but a natural part of that process, a part of the way your body maintains life by continuously exchanging matter with the environment. What is happening with your atoms is not disappearance, but a change of state. And to understand that fully, it is necessary to look at the deeper nature of the atom and the conditions required to actually destroy it. Because in daily life, in breathing, in digestion, in all biological processes, there is no reaction strong enough to change the nuclear structure of the atom. Everything that happens is only the rearrangement of electrons in chemical bonds, while the core of the atom, where protons and neutrons are located, remains unchanged. And to affect this core, you need enormous levels of energy that only exist in extreme environments, like the cores of stars, where temperatures can reach millions to tens of millions of degrees Kelvin, for example, in the core of the sun, where the temperature is about 15 million degrees Kelvin, allowing hydrogen nuclei to collide strongly enough to overcome electromagnetic repulsion and fuse in nuclear fusion reactions, forming helium and releasing enormous energy. And it is in such conditions that the structure of the atom is truly changed, when protons and neutrons are rearranged into new nuclei. And in addition, in nuclear fission reactions on Earth, such as in reactors or nuclear weapons, heavy nuclei like uranium can be split into smaller nuclei. But even in those cases, atoms do not disappear, but only turn into other atoms, along with energy. And the important thing is that these processes are completely different from what happens in your body, because breathing is only a chain of chemical reactions, where molecules are restructured by creating and breaking chemical bonds. But there is no change at the nuclear level, and this means that every carbon atom you exhale in the form of carbon dioxide is still that same carbon atom with the same number of protons in the nucleus, not destroyed, not turned into something else, simply no longer located in the biological structure of your body. And if you track such an atom, you will see that it can exist through countless cycles. It may have once been in a star billions of years ago, formed through nuclear synthesis, then dispersed into space when that star ended its life cycle, becoming part of the cloud of matter that formed the solar system, then eventually becoming part of Earth, participating in geological and biological cycles, entering your body through food or air, and then leaving you again when you exhale. And that journey does not stop there. It continues through other ecosystems, other organisms, and may last for millions or billions more years. And throughout that journey, the atom is not destroyed, not lost, but only changes position and role in different systems. And this leads to a very clear realization that when you exhale, you do not lose any part of the universe. You are only transferring matter from an organized structure to a more dispersed state, but the atoms themselves still exist, still continue their journey. And this also explains why we can trace the origin of the elements in our bodies to processes that occurred in stars, because the carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen atoms in your body today have existed long before life appeared on Earth, and will continue to exist long after they leave you. And when looking at it this way, each breath you take is not a loss, but part of a continuous cycle where atoms are reused, redistributed, and continue to exist in a universe where matter is not destroyed, but only transformed. The entire chain of phenomena you have just gone through, from the atoms leaving your body until they spread into the atmosphere, pass through plants, animals, and return to other bodies, is actually not separate events, but the manifestation of a single system, a system of matter and energy that continuously operates on a planetary scale and beyond. And when looking at that system, you begin to realize that what is called yourself is not a separate entity, but part of the common flow, because the atoms that make up you do not stop at the body's boundary, but continuously exchange with the surrounding environment, entering and leaving. And if you track them long enough, you will see that there is no point where you can say, this is where I end and the world begins. At the physical level, because the air you inhale has once passed through the lungs of countless other creatures. The food you eat has once been part of soil, of plants, of animals. And the atoms in your body originate from processes that occurred in stars billions of years ago. This means you are not only connected to the surrounding environment, but also to the entire history of the universe. And this connection is not a philosophical idea, but a physical reality that can be described by laws, because all atoms obey the same set of rules, from Brownian motion, to fusion, to biogeochemical cycles, and the laws of thermodynamics. And it is those laws that ensure that matter does not stand still, but always moves, always mixes, and always reorganizes. And in that process, there is no absolute separation between systems, only regions where matter is organized in different ways for a certain period of time. And your body is one such region, a temporary structure in the continuous flow of matter, where atoms gather to form a system capable of sustaining life, thought, and perception. But those atoms themselves are not bound permanently. They continue their journey when they leave you. And this makes the concept of separation inaccurate when considered at the most basic level. Because if you and the surrounding world continuously exchange matter with each other, then there is no fixed boundary between the two sides, only a continuous process of exchange and reorganization. And when you exhale, you are not simply removing something unnecessary, but putting a part of your matter into the common system where it will continue to move, participate in other cycles, and become part of other structures. And in that sense, you do not exist as an isolated entity, but as a node in a vast network where everything is connected to each other through the movement of atoms and energy. And if you expand your view further, you will see that this network is not limited to Earth, but is also part of the larger universe, where atoms are created in stars, dispersed through space, condense into planets, and eventually become part of life. And when you recognize this, you will see that your existence is not a separate phenomenon, but part of a continuous process extending through space and time, where matter and energy constantly transform and reorganize. And precisely because of that, the idea that you are a completely independent entity becomes no longer appropriate when considered at the atomic level, because every atom in your body has once been somewhere else and will continue to go to other places. And in that process, they connect you to everything around you, from the air you breathe, to trees, animals, other people, and even the stars that existed long before you appeared. And this leads to a very clear conclusion, that there is no real separation between you and the universe, only a continuity of matter and energy in which you are a temporary but inseparable part. Every breath you take, especially when you exhale, is not simply a familiar physiological action, but a physical process that can be described precisely, in which matter leaves your body and enters a long journey in the universe. Because with every exhalation, you release about 10 to the 22nd power gas molecules, containing atoms that were just a part of blood, of cells, of organic molecules that participated in your energy metabolism only seconds earlier. And these atoms do not disappear, but immediately blend into the air, drawn into the chaotic motion of surrounding molecules, colliding billions of times per second, losing all traces of their original origin, then continuing to spread thanks to diffusion, wind, convection, and large-scale atmospheric currents. And in just a few days, they can travel hundreds of kilometers. In a few months to a few years, they can be mixed throughout Earth's entire atmosphere, becoming part of the air that every other living creature is inhaling. And from there, their journey does not stop, because a portion of the carbon dioxide molecules will be absorbed by plants through photosynthesis, where the carbon atoms are restructured into glucose, becoming part of leaves, stems, or other organic compounds, then continuing into the food chain, when other creatures consume that plant, and eventually possibly becoming part of another creature's body, possibly an animal, possibly a human. And this process occurs continuously across the entire planet, without stopping, without a clear ending point. And throughout that entire cycle, the atoms are not destroyed, not lost, but only change position and role, participating in different structures over time. And this leads to an important realization, that when you exhale, you do not disappear, you do not lose your matter in the absolute sense, but you are spreading out, putting your atoms into a larger system, where they continue to exist and participate in other processes. And if you track a specific atom long enough, you will see that it is not attached to any structure forever. It can be part of you for a period of time, then become part of the air, then of a leaf, then of another creature. And that cycle can repeat many times, lasting through many generations of organisms. And in that process, the atom does not carry identity, does not carry memory. It only obeys physical and chemical laws. But that very movement creates a profound connection between everything, because all living creatures share the same source of matter, the same atmosphere, the same continuous exchange cycle. And this means the boundary you perceive between yourself and the surrounding world is not an absolute physical boundary, but a distinction at the perceptual level, while at the atomic level, everything is continuously exchanging and connecting. And when you look at your breath in this context, you will see that every breath is not just a biological action, but part of the way the universe operates, a process in which matter is not held fixed, but continuously spreads, mixes, and reorganizes. And this aligns with the basic laws of physics, especially the tendency to increase entropy, where systems move toward more dispersed states over time. And every time you exhale, you are contributing to that tendency. You are moving atoms from a highly organized state in your body to a more dispersed state in the environment. And this process cannot be reversed naturally because the probability of the atoms spontaneously returning to their exact original positions is extremely small, and therefore the spreading of the atoms is inevitable, the result of the laws governing the entire universe. And when you realize this, the way you look at yourself may change, because you are no longer a static entity, but part of a continuous flow where atoms come and go, where matter is reused and restructured, and where everything is connected through continuous exchange. And in that flow, you exist as a temporary but stable structure, a pattern maintained while the material components continuously change. And when the atoms leave you, they do not disappear, but continue their journey, carrying your matter out into the world. And in that sense, you do not only exist in your own body, but are continuously spreading out with every breath, every moment, becoming part of the air, of trees, of other creatures, and of the entire system you have always belonged to. And that is not a philosophical idea, but an accurate description of how matter and energy operate in the universe, where there is no absolute disappearance, but only transformation, no absolute separation, but only continuity, and each breath you take is direct evidence of that law. A small process, but reflecting the profound nature of the world you live in. If you want to continue exploring scientific facts that make you see the world in a completely different way, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for following until the end, and I will see you again in the next exploration journey.